My family told me my wedding was going to be the most embarrassing afternoon of their lives. My mother said those words with complete calm, like she was making an observation about the weather. My sister's fiancé offered to write me a check on the spot to help me find something more appropriate. My father nodded along, and the table went quiet in the way that meant everyone agreed, but no one wanted to say it out loud. What none of them knew was that the man sitting quietly beside me, the one my mother called just a software guy, had spent the last 3 years building a company that would go public on the Toronto Stock Exchange at a valuation of $3.2 billion on the exact morning of our wedding. What none of them knew was that my sister's fiancé, the man they had been treating like royalty for 8 months, would spend that same afternoon sitting across from RCMP investigators trying to explain why millions of dollars in client deposits had moved through a chain of numbered companies registered offshore. And when everything collapsed and my mother finally found my number and texted me asking whether there was still any room left, I read the message once, set my phone face down on my lap, and typed back exactly 2 words. Too late. Before I get into what happened, let me tell you where I come from, because none of this makes sense without that part. I grew up in Surrey, British Columbia, in a neighborhood where people took their lawns very seriously and judged their neighbors by the kind of car parked in the driveway. My parents, my younger sister Giselle, and I lived in a 4-bedroom house on a quiet cul-de-sac that my father had spent 30 years making look more expensive than it was. He worked in commercial insurance. My mother managed a dental office front desk. They were good at seeming prosperous. They were very good at that. Giselle was 3 years younger than me, and from the time she was about 12 years old, she understood something I never quite did. That in our household, the loudest, most glamorous version of a person always won. She learned to perform for my parents. I just worked. I put myself through my dental hygiene program at Kwantlen, got certified, started working at a community clinic in Burnaby. I was proud of what I had built. My parents found it difficult to describe at dinner parties. "She's in dental," my mother would say, with the tone of someone apologizing. I met Elliot at a friend's going-away party in East Vancouver on a rainy Thursday night in November. He was quiet in a way that people sometimes mistake for unfriendly. He had shown up in a plain gray crewneck and jeans, holding a beer he had barely touched, and we ended up talking in the kitchen about the Canucks for 2 hours. He told me he worked in software. He did not elaborate, and I did not push. I found out later that software meant he had founded a company called Arcadian Systems that was developing AI-assisted triage tools for rural and remote health clinics, a problem he had become obsessed with after growing up in a small town outside of Prince George, where the nearest emergency room was 90 minutes away. When I introduced him to my family 8 months after we started dating, he wore the same kind of plain crewneck he always wore. He said very little. My mother asked him where he saw himself in 5 years. He said he was working on a few things. My father asked what kind of car he drove. Elliot said he usually took transit or borrowed his building's car share. That was the end of the conversation as far as my family was concerned. I knew who Elliot really was. He had walked me through everything: the company, the investors, the quiet years of building, the rounds of funding he had never posted about online. He did not want the attention. He wanted to solve the problem. But I had asked him, when things started to get serious between us, whether he was okay keeping it private from my family for a while longer. I told him I wanted them to like him, or reject him, based on who he actually was in a room, not what he had. He looked at me for a long moment and then smiled, a small and slightly dangerous smile. He said, "Okay, but you know they are going to make us both pay for that." He was not wrong. The Easter Sunday dinner, when everything exploded, had started quietly enough. My mother had made her traditional ham, the one she brought out for significant occasions and funerals. I was nervous in a way I recognized from childhood, that specific alertness you develop when you have spent your whole life learning to read the temperature of a room before you speak. I had brought printed invitations. Elliot had designed them himself. Clean, minimal, cream cardstock with a simple script. The wedding was set for the last Saturday of September, at Elliot's family property in the Okanagan, just outside of Kelowna. I knew my family had certain assumptions about that. They had never visited. They imagined, based on everything they thought they knew about Elliot, something along the lines of a rented picnic area near a lake. I placed the envelopes on the table after the main course was cleared. My mother picked hers up and held it by the corner. The way you would handle a flyer someone had stuffed under your windshield wiper. And then my sister pulled out a glossy brochure. She announced, with the particular brightness she reserved for moments designed to flatten me, that Harrison had booked a private waterfront venue in Victoria for their engagement party. She announced the date, the same date, the last Saturday of September. I stared at her. She said, with great patience and great sweetness, that the venue had been completely unavailable on any other weekend until the following spring, and Harrison simply could not wait that long. She said that a property out in wine country was a charming idea, of course, but no one could be expected to drive all the way to the Okanagan when there was a much more accessible event happening in Victoria on the same day. She reached over and patted my hand. My mother set down her fork and told me it would make more sense if Elliot and I found a different weekend. Nothing dramatic, just practical. My father said something about Harrison already having made deposits, about commitments, about how the engagement party would be attended by some very important people from Vancouver's real estate community, people my father had decided were future business contacts. I looked across the table. I thought about all the years I had made myself smaller in that house. The graduation they had left early to take my sister to a birthday dinner. The bursary I had won that they forgot to mention at Christmas. The way they had never once asked Elliot a single follow-up question about his work, not in 8 months of knowing him. I said my date was not changing. My mother sighed in the way she did when she wanted you to understand that she was being very patient with someone unreasonable. And then Harrison set down his wineglass. Harrison was 36, broad-shouldered and deeply in love with the sound of his own voice. He wore cufflinks to Easter dinner. He liked to work phrases like net-net and at the end of the day bottom line into ordinary conversation. He had sold enough Vancouver pre-sale condos to accumulate a lot of money very quickly, and he wore all of it, constantly. My family treated him like someone who had arrived from a better, more successful dimension and was generously allowing them to stand near him. He reached into the inner pocket of his sport coat and produced a small leather folder. He opened it with practiced ease and wrote a check, sliding it across the table toward me. It was for $8,000. He said I should use it to book a hotel ballroom. Something central. Something my guests would not have to plan an overnight trip around. He smiled. He said, "Think of it as a gift from us. We would hate to see you settle for something that does not reflect what the day deserves." My mother clasped her hands together like someone at a church service receiving very good news. My sister looked at the ceiling like she was already imagining the engagement photos. I looked at the check. I looked at Elliot. He was watching Harrison with that particular stillness he had. The stillness of someone who is processing information very carefully and very quietly and has absolutely nothing to prove. I pushed the check back across the table. I thanked Harrison and told him we were managing the budget just fine. Then I said very calmly that I had come across something interesting in some recent public filings, that FINTRAC had flagged a pattern of suspicious transactions tied to a numbered company registered under a familiar set of initials, and that the pre-sale deposit structures connected to those flagged transactions had been drawing attention from provincial securities regulators since the previous autumn. The room went extremely still. Harrison's face did something complicated. The easy confidence drained out of it, replaced by something tighter and much more animal. He said I had no idea what I was talking about. I said I was probably wrong. I was just a dental hygienist after all. I picked up my jacket. Elliot stood up beside me, not hurried, not dramatic, just present and solid. I thanked my parents for the dinner. I told my sister I was genuinely happy for her. I walked out of the house with my spine straight and my hands steady, and I breathed in the cool Surrey evening air like I had been holding my breath for 29 years. The next 48 hours were exactly what I expected. My sister posted a photograph of herself and Harrison looking exhausted and sorrowful. The caption ran for several paragraphs about feeling unsupported by the people closest to her. She mentioned jealousy, she mentioned insecurity, she framed the entire story as a tragedy in which she was the only named character. She did not mention dates or checks or anything else that could be verified. My phone filled up with messages from relatives I saw twice a year at best. My uncle sent a lengthy paragraph. A cousin I had last seen at my grandmother's funeral told me I was embarrassing the whole family. An aunt I had not spoken to in 3 years found the time to call and leave a voicemail I listened to exactly once. I sat on the floor of our apartment in East Van with my laptop open and made a folder. I saved every screenshot, every message, every comment. Elliot sat beside me with 2 mugs of tea saying almost nothing, which was one of the things I loved most about him. He asked once if he should step in, he could make a call, he could have his communications team release something, he could end all of it within a news cycle. I told him no, I told him exactly what I wanted and he listened, and then he nodded and said, "Okay, then we wait." 3 days later, my father called. He announced he was withdrawing his financial contribution to our wedding. He said this with the gravity of someone canceling a major sponsorship. He had offered nothing, he had contributed nothing from the beginning, but he delivered it like a sentence, like something I should feel the weight of. I told him we were fully covered and that I genuinely hoped he and my mother enjoyed their time in Victoria. There was a pause. And then he said, "Your grandmother's ring." My grandmother had died 18 months earlier. She had been the one person in my family who had ever looked at me with simple, direct love. No performance required, no comparison made. She had left me her engagement ring in her will, an Edwardian piece with a rose-cut diamond set in white gold that had lived in a velvet box in her dresser drawer for 60 years. My mother had contested the bequest, briefly and unsuccessfully. The ring was legally mine. My father told me my sister needed to borrow it for the engagement party, that she needed something meaningful to wear for the photographs, that Harrison's ring was lovely but it did not carry family history, and the guests at the Victoria venue would appreciate something with a story behind it. He said, "And I want you to hear this." He actually said, "You are having a backyard thing in September. You do not need to be draped in heirlooms for that." I was quiet for a moment. Then I told him that was absolutely fine, that I would give my sister exactly what was left inside Gran's velvet jewelry box, and she was welcome to all of it. He hung up sounding satisfied. We met at a café on Cambie. I chose it because it had large windows and good afternoon light and a seating area where a public meltdown would be clearly visible to everyone in the room. My sister arrived 12 minutes late wearing sunglasses she did not remove inside. She had shopping bags from Aritzia and a coffee from somewhere better than where we were meeting. She sat across from me and held out her hand without saying hello. I passed her Gran's velvet jewelry box. She grabbed it, she pressed the small brass latch, the lid popped open, she looked inside. There was no ring. There was a folded piece of paper, the original will excerpt, notarized, naming me as sole beneficiary, and beneath that, a receipt from a jeweler on Granville Street dated 6 weeks earlier, documenting the removal and resetting of one rose-cut diamond. My sister looked up. I raised my left hand. The diamond sat in the center of my new wedding band, reset in a clean modern bezel, catching the afternoon light coming through the cafe's front windows. Elliot had arranged it with a jeweler he trusted. The stone was exactly where it belonged, on my hand in my marriage, permanently attached to the life I had chosen. My sister stared at it. She said nothing for what felt like a very long time. And then she stood up and slammed both hands on the table hard enough that the couple at the next table looked over. She said things I will not repeat in detail. She used the word vicious. She used the word jealous. She said Harrison was 10 times the man Elliot would ever be. She said I was bitter and pathetic, and that clinging to a piece of old jewelry was the most desperate thing she had ever seen from anyone in her life. She reached across the table and tried to grab my hand. I moved it back calmly. I told her to look around the cafe. I asked whether this was how she wanted people to see her. I mentioned that the notarized document sitting on the table between us would make very interesting reading for anyone who wanted to question the legality of her claim on the ring. She picked up her iced tea and flung it at the edge of the table. It hit the floor beside our chairs. The cafe went still. A manager appeared from somewhere near the counter, moving quickly. I picked up my jacket, said goodbye to my sister, and walked out into the spring rain on Cambie Street. Harrison was waiting on the sidewalk. He stepped directly into my path. He was not smiling. He said I had made a serious mistake. He said he had influence in this city, that he knew people at the municipal and provincial level, that what I had said at Easter dinner about Fintrack was defamatory, and I would hear from his lawyers before the end of the week. He said that years of watching my sister succeed had turned me into someone small and bitter, and that the ceremony I was planning in some orchard somewhere was never going to change who I fundamentally was. And then he smiled. He told me he had already arranged for my entire extended family to attend the engagement party in Victoria. Hotel rooms booked near the inner harbor. Flights arranged for the relatives who needed them. He had spoken to my parents. He said everyone was confirmed. He had ensured that on my wedding day, the only people in those vineyard chairs would be strangers to me. He waited. He wanted to see me break. I could see the anticipation in the way he held himself, waiting for the tears, the pleas, the negotiation. I thought about Elliot, who had built something real for 3 years without telling anyone who did not need to know. I thought about the TSX filing, processed quietly 2 weeks earlier. I thought about the morning that was coming. 7 weeks away, and everything that was already in motion. I said, "Thank you, Harrison, you just saved us a significant amount on catering." I walked past him toward the parking garage on the next block. He called after me. I did not turn around. The last Saturday of September arrived with the kind of sky the Okanagan produces in autumn. High, clear, faintly gold at the edges, the kind of light that makes the hillside vineyards look like something painted by someone who wanted you to feel something. I had been awake before 6, lying still and listening to the sprinklers running on the lower terrace. The property had been in Elliot's family for over 40 years. His grandfather had bought the land when Kelowna was still mostly an orchard town, and the idea of it becoming what it had become seemed implausible to most people. The house sat at the top of a long gravel drive lined with trembling aspens, with a clear view of Okanagan Lake that on mornings like this one stretched all the way to the mountains on the far shore. The ceremony space had been arranged on the lower terrace, under strings of warm light and an arch of late-blooming wild roses. Nothing excessive, everything exactly right. The guests who had been arriving since the previous evening were people who moved through the world the way Elliot did. Quietly, with purpose, without needing anyone to notice. There was the woman who had co-founded 2 of Canada's largest clean technology funds. There was an architect whose work had reshaped a significant portion of East Vancouver. There were researchers and rural physicians and a former federal deputy minister who had flown in from Ottawa specifically for this day. People who had known Elliot for years, who understood what Arcadian Systems was actually trying to do, who had seen the work up close and knew its worth. At 8:47 in the morning, while I was sitting in the upstairs room of the main house having my hair pinned back, Elliot's phone lit up on the dresser beside me. He glanced at it. He looked at me with that specific stillness of his. He said the opening trade had cleared. Arcadian Systems had listed on the TSX at $6.20 per share. In the first 40 minutes of trading, it had climbed past $9. His company was valued as of that morning at approximately $3.2 billion. I set down my tea. I pressed my hand lightly over my grandmother's diamond. I asked, "How does it feel?" He said, "I will tell you at the end of the day." In Victoria, the situation had been deteriorating since 9 o'clock. The engagement venue Harrison had arranged had never confirmed the final deposit. A backup location had been organized in a rush, and most guests had received the address change by text that same morning. My family arrived to find the doors locked, and a building manager who was very sorry and had a schedule to keep and needed the balance paid before he could open anything. Harrison stood in the car park on his phone, sweating in the October morning in a white linen blazer that had not been designed for this kind of weather or this kind of day. 3 credit cards declined in sequence. The photographer Harrison had hired had sent an urgent email the previous evening to an address that turned out to have a typo in it. My sister was in her dress. She had been in her dress since 8 o'clock. My uncle found a bench. My aunt stood with her arms crossed. My mother scrolled through her phone looking for something that would explain this in a way that did not implicate Harrison. At 11:22 a.m. Pacific Time, the Globe and Mail's financial desk published a short piece about Arcadian Systems and the extraordinary trading volume it had generated at open. The piece was accurate and well-sourced. It included a paragraph about the founder, his name, his background, his family's long connection to the Okanagan Valley. At 11:30, CBC picked it up. At 11:38, a photographer who had been contracted for our ceremony sent a clip to a contact at CTV Vancouver. It showed the lower terrace, the rose arch, the rows of wooden chairs filled with people, and Okanagan Lake, glittering at the base of the hills in the autumn light. It showed Elliot in a dark suit standing under the arch. It showed me walking toward him along the gravel path between 2 rows of late-season lavender. It was, by any measure, a stunning piece of footage. They used it on the afternoon bulletin. My mother was standing outside the locked venue, holding someone else's phone when the clip began to play. She watched the camera move across the estate. She listened to the CBC anchor say Arcadian Systems. She listened to the analyst they had brought in say 3.2 billion. She watched me walk toward Elliot and take his hands under the wild rose arch. She did not say anything for a long time after the clip ended. Harrison, at that same moment, had been approached by two men who identified themselves and asked if he could answer a few questions. RCMP investigators working alongside Fintrack had been building a file on a numbered company connected to Harrison's development portfolio for nearly a year. Several buyers from stalled pre-sale projects had filed complaints. The structure of the deposits, money that had moved offshore before the projects collapsed, had generated the kind of regulatory attention that does not resolve itself quietly when you stop returning calls. He was not formally arrested that afternoon, but he left with the investigators, which meant he simply left. He walked away from the locked venue, and my sister standing in her dress, and every relative I had ever sat across from at a Christmas table. My cousin found out about the investigation from someone who had seen it shared online. She showed it to my uncle. He showed it to my father. My father sat down on the same bench my uncle had found an hour earlier. The ceremony at the estate was one of the quietest and most complete moments I have ever lived through. It did not feel like a performance. It felt like the end of a long and difficult season and the beginning of something I had arrived at through deliberate, patient choice. The mayor of Kelowna, who had spent years working alongside Elliot on rural healthcare access initiatives across the interior, had cleared his full afternoon to officiate. He spoke about the particular kind of person who builds something slowly and without announcing it to anyone, and about the specific strength it takes to understand your own value while the people around you insist on underestimating it. I thought about my grandmother when he said that. I looked at the diamond on my hand. I cried once, quietly, when Elliot said the specific words he had chosen for his vows, which I will not share here because they were meant only for me. When it was done, when we walked back up the gravel path together, Elliot's communications director was waiting at the edge of the terrace. She told us the CBC anchor wanted a statement. Elliot looked at me. I said, "Tell them the truth, tell them everything." He spoke to a reporter for 6 minutes with the lake behind him. He talked about Arcadian Systems. He talked about remote healthcare and emergency response times in northern communities, and the years it had taken to build a product he believed in. When the reporter asked about the timing, about launching on the TSX on his own wedding day, Elliot said simply that some things in your life are too important to delay, and that the woman standing beside him had understood that from the beginning. I did not speak on camera. I did not need to. By early evening in Victoria, my family had sorted themselves into smaller, exhausted groups on the pavement outside the venue. My sister was sitting on a low wall near the water, her dress collecting October dust at the hem. My mother had spent an hour calling hotels to confirm the reservations Harrison had promised. 2 of them had no record of a booking. The third had a reservation, but the card on file had been declined at check-in. She found a place with free Wi-Fi and sat in a corner booth for a long time. She opened her texts. She found my name. She had not texted me since a brief cold message the previous week that said she hoped my little event went smoothly. She typed for a while, she deleted it, she typed again. What she sent finally was, "Sweetie, it's your mother. We have had a very difficult day. Is there any chance there is still room at your venue? We could make the drive tonight." Sweetie, she called me sweetie. I read it twice. I thought about the years I had tried, not to be impressive, not to win anything, just to be real to these people. To exist in their eyes as someone worth acknowledging. I thought about every version of myself I had quietly folded away so I would not take up too much room at the table. I thought about the card my grandmother had written me on my last birthday before she died. She had written, "You have always known who you are, love. Most people spend their whole lives figuring that out. You were born knowing. Don't let anyone take that from you." I typed 2 words. I hit send. I put the phone face down in my lap and looked out at Okanagan Lake, which had turned the color of hammered copper in the last light of the day. Elliot was nearby, finishing a quiet conversation with someone from his team. He glanced over and read my expression without asking. He came and sat beside me without saying anything. He put his hand over mine. After a while he said, "Ready?" I told him yes. We walked around the side of the main house to the north field, where a de Havilland Beaver floatplane was moored at the edge of the estate's private dock. The pilot was from Kelowna, an old friend of Elliot's from the summers he had spent here as a boy. He had flown wilderness camps and search and rescue routes and everything in between, and he greeted us with the easy calm of someone who had no interest in occasion or status, only in making sure the instruments were reading correctly. The guests had gathered on the upper terrace to watch us go. As I stepped onto the dock, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket one last time. I did not take it out. I already knew. The engine turned over, and the pontoons lifted off the surface, and the lake fell away beneath us in the fading light, and I watched the estate shrink to a warm rectangle of windows in the dark hills, and then smaller, and then gone. And below us there was nothing but water and mountains and the long quiet black of the British Columbia interior, and I was the lightest I had ever been in my life. If you are listening to this and you come from a family that spent years deciding you were the difficult one, the small one, the one who didn't quite fit the picture they wanted to display, I need you to hear this. You do not owe access to your life to people who treated your life like it had no value. Choosing to close a door on the people who raised you is not something you do quickly or without pain. I am not going to stand here and tell you it does not hurt. It does. It hurts in a way that does not have a name that covers all of it. But there is a peace on the other side of that decision that nothing else produces. A quiet that belongs entirely to you. My family thought they were watching me fail. They thought a property in the Okanagan and a quiet man who took the bus meant I had given up on myself. They were watching me choose exactly what I wanted. They just did not know yet what that was worth. Some people spend their whole lives performing. Elliot spent his building something real and true and lasting, and I spent mine becoming someone who knew how to tell the difference. I walked onto that floatplane with my grandmother's diamond on my hand and the man I love beside me, and I left every unlocked door I had ever held open for people who chose, over and over, not to walk through it. I closed them all. And I did not look back.